Three Religious Rebels, Part 2, on the life of St. Alberic, Chapter 1. This chapter is entitled, You're a Radical. If anyone should ask, where was Alberic born? The only answer possible is that nobody knows. When was Alberic born? Nobody knows. Who were his parents? Nobody knows. What was his family? His early education, his social status? Nobody knows. But ignorance of these matters means little, for sanctity is not a question of the cradle or romper days. It is a matter of growth and maturity. In other words, history was kind when she buried all data concerning Alberic prior to his going to the hermits at Cologne. For while the boy may be the father to the man, the apple is always a better test of the tree than its blossom. Indeed, the day he joined the hermits was his real birthday, the day he began to live to God in the special way that was to mean his ultimate sanctity. Of course, you can conjecture on the probable date of his natural birth, for when Stephen Harding met him about 1080, Alberic described himself as a midland man. He said he was middle-aged, middle-sized, of middling brain and middling virtue. Stephen told him that he uttered a half-truth, but Alberic would not accept the implied compliment. Therefore, you may conclude that Alberic was born just about the time that Robert had learned that God was looking for someone to stand in the gap, that is, somewhere about 1033. Concerning his lineage, a plausible guess may be made from the story of the founding of Cologne. It was said that two brothers had become the bitterest of rivals for the championship of the various tourneys. They had jousted again and again, but never with any decisive result. First one would win, then the other. Jealousy generated bitterness, and this grew to such an extent that each resolved to get rid of the other. One day, as they were riding home, after another unsatisfactory morning of tilting, they passed through the forest of Cologne. In the hush of the woods they heard their own hearts beat, and each determined to accomplish his murderous design that day. By common impulse they reined their mounts, when suddenly both were filled with horror at their contemplated crime. Without a word, they wheeled their horses, dug frightened spurs into their sides, and galloped off together to the hut of a holy priest who was living a hermit's life in the depths of the wood. After they had confessed to him, they confessed to each other. Shame soon gave way to consternation at Satan's hold on them, because of their passion for glory. Kneeling, they clasped hands and vowed to have done with the world. Then, on the very spot of the contemplated fratricide, they built a hermitage, resolving to spend the rest of their lives questing for God's glory rather than their own. Shortly after, 4 of their former companions, all nobles and warriors, joined them. This was the group of 7 who besought Robert to be their father in religion. On the basis of this account, it is safe to say that Alberic was of noble parentage. That he was not one of the brothers is quite certain. That he was a warrior is absolutely sure. Everything about him, from his ready good nature to his discipline and unquestionable bravery, stamps him as a soldier. One evening in the August of 1099, Alberic was seated at a rough desk in the abbot's room of Little Citeaux. Beside him stood Stephen Harding, his prior. The air was filled with the scent of wild roses that came from a thicket beneath the abbot's window. Robert had not been gone a full month. Alberic had been elected to succeed him and had immediately appointed Stephen as prior. The two were hardly used to their positions, but were busy laying plans. Alberic was insisting that statutes be drawn up clearly avoiding all the practices of Molem and all the Cluniac customs. He wanted Citeaux to be Cistercian, he said, pure Benedictine. Stephen was shaking his head in disagreement. Finally he said, "Reverend Father, it can't be done." "But I tell you it can be done and will be done. Just look at the spirit of our men," came the fiery reply. "Yes," answered Stephen honestly, "the present community can do it, and will do it gladly. But what of the future? You're not forgetting Malem, are you?" Alberic eyed him suspiciously. "Am I forgetting Malem? Is that English humor? If you had been beaten by your own monks, if you had had your head broken and your shoulders beaten black and blue, if you had been thrown into a dungeon and kept there a prisoner, would you likely forget it? Am I forgetting Malem?" No, you misunderstand me, Reverend Father. I was only thinking of how well we started at that monastery and how poorly we ended. You must not forget that it was the younger element that failed to measure up." "And the point of your argument?" asked Albert. "You are going to ask for more than Robert ever demanded. You want the utter simplicity of the primitive rule." "Right. Well, you can do it and I can follow, and the community we have now will be right behind us. But 10 years from now?" "With God's help," said Alberic, "we'll have a larger monastery, a larger community, and the utter simplicity of the primitive rule." Stephen knew what was in his abbot's mind. He had learned a lesson the hard way at Malem. He wanted no repetition. Stephen liked his ideas, was in favor of his methods, but was very much afraid of the weakness in man. After some hesitation, he finally shook his head, declaring, "Alberic, if Robert was a rebel, you're a radical." The abbot's gray eyes held Stephen a moment. "I don't know whether you mean that as a compliment or as a condemnation. You English puzzle me. But I can tell you this, if you mean radical in the Roman sense, you have struck me off perfectly. I am ever intend to remain radical. I mean to go down to the very roots of things, and the present roots that interest me are the roots of the rule." "But have you looked far into the future?" insisted Stephen. "It is the future that has determined me," replied the abbot. "Not my future, nor yours, but God's future. I know what you're worrying about. You're worrying about the youth of France, aren't you?" Stephen nodded. "Stephen, if you were a youngster whose father had taken the cross and gone to battle for God, what would your feelings be? If your older brothers and all your male relatives had battled about Jerusalem's walls and wrested that city from the enemies of the faith, what would your ambition be?" "To outdo them," came the unhesitating reply. "Right," said Alberic, to be as good as your elders would never satisfy you. But don't you think that the youth of France have as much fire and as lively a fancy as the English?" Stephen smiled. It seemed that his abbot could never forget his nationality. "To avoid an argument and bring you to your point," he said, I'll admit that they have." "Then my point is made," cried the abbot as his hand struck the desk. "You worry about the community 10 years from now. They will be the sons of the Crusaders. Do you hear? The sons of the Crusaders. They will have learned how their sires left Europe, numbering 600,000, how they took Edessa and Antioch, then marched on, battled on, bled, starved, thirsted, and died until there were only 50,000 left. Think of it. Less than 1/10 of the original army. They will have learned how these 50,000 camped around the walls of Jerusalem, how it was midsummer, how the brook of Cedron had dried up and the wells about it had been poisoned or destroyed. They will have learned how there, under a brazen sky, in the midst of a blistered plain, these 50,000 thirsted almost as the God-man had thirsted outside those same walls the very day he died. They will have learned how this remnant held on, assaulted the city, took it, then knelt as suppliants and conquerors in the church of the resurrection." The abbot paused. His face was flushed and his eyes held the light of the sun. "Stephen," he said, With such an inspiration before them, don't you see how the sons of these crusaders will revel in being gallant to God? Why, they will be aflame with zeal to keep the rule to its very hilt. If they can see as you have seen, said Robert slowly. They will, replied the abbot. If I am not here to make them, you will be. The lance that pierced the heart of Christ was found miraculously at Antioch. It became a spur to our crusading knights. It will be the same to the youth of France. Chivalry, Stephen, is not for the battlefields and the secular world alone. It has its place here in the cloister. As the prior nodded, the abbot went on. Down deep in the heart of every man, Stephen, is a secret spot, which, if once touched, will make him more than man, will make him hero. I have seen it, said the abbot with flashing eyes. So have you. Look at what happened to Europe these past few years. Give men a cause and a commander, and they forget that they are men and become lovers. That's the story of Godfrey of Bouillon and the Crusade, and that will be the story of little Citeaux. Will you be the commander and the simplicity of the rule, the cause? Never, exclaimed the former warrior. There is only one commander, Christ, and only one cause, the honor and glory of God. There was a long pause. Albert looked off through the trees, but his mind's eye was seeing someone who had never walked those woods. The abbot arose and went to the window. After looking at the setting sun, he turned and said, I'll be judged, Stephen, according to the rule of St. Benedict. Not only as to how I kept it, but also as to how I explained it to others, how I interpreted it for others, how I got others to keep it. It's a sobering thought. Another serious thought is that of the centuries yet to come. What you and I do in this little abbey of Citeaux, Stephen, will affect those centuries. Never forget it. Christ is one. The church is one. We are all one. Therefore, what we do affects the entire body. Albert broke off. And now that Robert has gone from us, how we are going to miss him. Oh, but Alberic, haven't you been doing most of the work for some time? I have, but the responsibility was his. Now it is different. You sound afraid. The abbot sat down and leaned on his desk. Afraid? He asked Stephen. I'm frightened. Believe me, if it wasn't for the lance the Crusaders found, if it wasn't for the tomb the Crusaders won, if it wasn't for the Christ who lived and died and lives again, I couldn't do it. I'm not brave, Stephen, but thank God I've got faith. He put me here. He'll help me here, and help me to keep the rule to the hilt. Robert used to say, to the letter. I know it, said Alberic as he straightened, but I'm going to go further than Robert went. I'm going to go back to the simplicity of the rule in everything. And that means war. All I can think of is a naked saber plunged to the hilt. Citeaux is going to comfort the heart of Christ. Come, said Stephen, rising to hide his emotion. It's prayer time. The future rests with God. As he walked down the chapel corridor behind his resolute-looking abbot, the shadow of a smile played around Stephen Harding's lips. It was a smile of admiration and affection. He was thinking how strange it was to call Alberic abbot. He had known him so long and so intimately. He could remember the first day they had met. It was at Molem. Alberic was prior. Stephen recalled the torn robe Alberic was wearing. He certainly had been a nondescript monk, except for his smile. He was now thinking of what it must have cost Alberic to smile in those days, for this was before Troy's bishop had gone home hungry. Robert had certainly struck the secret spot in Alberic's soul, thought Stephen. Only a hero or frenzied lover could have smiled so happily during those trying years. Then came the memory of the wintry night Alberic had taken him aside, pointed to the evening star, and asked what it symbolized for him. Stephen had answered, purity. It looks so cold and chaste. Alberic laughed and said, "Chastity is not cold, my friend. It is white hot. Try again." Stephen had looked at the star a moment and said, "Obedience, steadfast obedience. That star has obeyed God without a single deviation ever since the moment of its creation." "Good," Alberic cried, and then asked, "Anything else?" Stephen studied the star again, but finally turned and said, "No, nothing more at the moment." Then Alberic asked, "Do you know what it means to our abbot?" Stephen did not know. "It means loneliness, love, leadership," said Alberic. "Robert sees it as the symbol of the rule, his symbol. He wants the rule rigidly kept. He knows he'll be alone and that it will take great love. But he always insists that stars come out after dark, that just as myriads of others stud the skies after vesper shining, so other monasteries will one day follow Molem. But he warns us, before they do, we shall have to see the dark." Stephen prayed for Alberic and himself that night. They were alone now. Robert, who had guided them all their religious lives, had been taken from them by obedience. They would miss him much. But Stephen found great comfort in the discovery he had made that night of the contradictory combination in Alberic's character. Timidity linked with intrepidity. He had admitted that he was afraid, and yet went ahead with his plans for a life without compromise. He was going to present the naked simplicity of the rule and see that it was observed. There was great comfort for Stephen in the discovery, and yet his prayer was for courage. Alberic prayed a similar prayer, for his thoughts were much the same. He went back over the years. He recalled leaving Cologne, the mere handful they were, just 13, but they had changed the wilderness of Molem into a monastic paradise. Then came the change. Compromises crept in. When he tried to curb them, there was the revolt. What a nightmare that was! Then came the real revolt, 20 of them with Robert to Citeaux. The work, success, then Robert's recall, his own election. What years, and now, God, come to my assistance. What was ahead? Lord, make haste to help me. Prayers seemed unbelievably short that night. Before he knew it, it was time for bed. He gave the signal, then took his stand at the door of the church in order to sprinkle each monk's head with holy water. It was the custom of the house. As he did it, he whispered, "Crusader for Christ, be brave." It was the real beginning of his abbacy.